I won't be able to remember all this.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks.
Welcome to White Research Center, the greatest place on earth to work. I'm Steve Schmidt, Deputy Center Director here at the Center, and I'm honored to be the Master of Ceremonies for this historic occasion. We are here today to honor three famous research pilots, Bill Dana, Jack McKay, and Joe Walker. These men are the nation's heroes, pioneers of our country's space program, in which they played a significant part in the continuation of the storied agency space program. These men we honor here today all flew the X-15 over the threshold of space of over 264,000 feet. They also represent a big part of the X-15 program, together accounting for 70 of the 199 flights of the X-15. I remember when I was a small man cub years ago, living here as a kid. Not to say anything about the age, but anyway, I remember the sounds and sonic booms that the aircraft like the X-15 and the XB-70 used to make, and the windows rattling. And laying down in tall, soft, cool grass, looking up at the sky, the bright blue sky that was up there, and seeing the contrails that these men left behind. And that left me with some dreams of being here as a child, of becoming a pilot, a space cowboy, an astronaut. A pivotal point came in my young life when I was given a personally signed X-15 model by a Major Robert A. Rushworth, which was made a significant impact on my life. And so I have you men to thank, or is that to blame, for where I am today. I'm pleased to see that the families of these three men are here in force. And first I want to welcome the Dana family. Bill's wife Judy, his son Matt. Matt is a fighter pilot that flew in today in an F-16 that came out here. Welcome. Daughter Jan, a son-in-law, and two grandchildren. Joe Walker's sons Jim and Tom. His daughter Beth are here with their mother Grace, as well as Joe's brother John. And then there's the McKay clan. You know, it's so numerous, I'm thinking about joining them after the celebration here. Among them, I'd like to recognize Sherry Lowe, daughter of John McKay, or Jack McKay, who will represent the family in this ceremony. I'd also like to mention John McKay, who is here today. John and I spent some quality time together on the SR-71 program. He's a good friend, longtime popular Dryden employee, and now he's joined the ranks of the retired. It's a little jealous, but I would also like to welcome a number of distinguished guests whom come long distances to be with us here today. To begin with, please acknowledge three former X-15 pilots in attendance. Former shuttle commander and retired Air Force General Joe Engel. Thanks for being here, Joe. Also, retired Air Force General Robert White. Thanks, Bob, for being here. And also, astronaut Neil Armstrong. Thanks very much for blessing us with your presence, Neil. Appreciate you coming. And I'd also like to mention Gail Knight, widow of beloved X-15 pilot Pete Knight. Gail was injured last week and won't be able to join us today. Additionally, please recognize me in recognizing a very good friend of mine, Dennis Jenkins. Dennis, would you please stand up? Dennis is the one who wanted to make sure these great men were given their proper place in history. It was his persistence, his diligence, his tenacity that made this event possible. The idea of obtaining astronaut wings for Bill, Joe, and Jack originated with Dennis, and he solicited the help of Tony Landis, who's down here in the corner, who's a contractor employee here at Dryden, who felt that in an age when flight outside the Earth's atmosphere may one day be available to everyone, NASA needed to embrace and celebrate the first men to fly into space in an aircraft. Without Dennis and Tony, there would be no ceremony today. Thanks very much, gentlemen. It is also my distinct pleasure to recognize from headquarters Dr. Vic LeBox, Associate Administrator for Aeronautics. Please, Vic. I'd also like to mention Bill Reedy, former Associate Administrator for Space Operations and a former astronaut who couldn't be with us here today but needs to be acknowledged for his collaboration with Dennis to get the astronaut wings for the F-15 pilots. From the Johnson Space Center, please welcome Kent Rominger, Chief of the Astronaut Office, who has lent his backing to this endeavor. From the Boeing Aircraft Company, I'd like to recognize Steve Oswald, whose firm Generosity supported this event. He's also and the Space Flight Awareness Office at headquarters, who also contributed to today's ceremony as well. In addition, we are also delighted to have with us Colonel Patrick Duffy, the new Flight Test Center Vice Commander. Les Bordelin from the Flight Test Center as well as the Technical Director. Dr. George Kylewine from the Flight Test Center. And of course, my friend Joe. And what we have further is Mr. Lou Stoltz from the Office of Congressman Buck McKeon. Mr. Andrew Mercy, representing State Senator George Runner. And Mr. Larry Grooms, representing Assemblywoman Sharon Runner. In addition, we have on hand one of the nation's most admired aviation space artists, Mike Bichat. You can't paint much from back there. Okay. We'd also like to, there are also many distinguished Dryden figures here as well that would contribute to the history. Former Director John Mankey. And we'd also like to include other celebrated pilots, or Stan Butcher. Fitz Fulton. And Don Mallett. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. We're also equally happy to have engineers Gene Matranga welcome, Gene. And as well, Bill's old friend and former Dryden Deputy Center Director, Ted Ayers. Also, we have in our presence former Center Director Ken Slay. also like to personally recognize a former NASA employee who worked on the X-15 programs here. It's part of my family, is Byron Gibbs. Someone said that the role of the Master of Ceremonies is simple. To make remarks brief enough to cover the essential points, but enough to be interesting. I can't be sure how interesting I am, but I'll do my best to fulfill the brevity part. With that, I'd like to introduce NASA Dryden's director, Kevin Peterson, to talk about what it took to fly the X-15. Kevin?
Thanks, Steve, and welcome everyone to this great event. I think it's a great opportunity we have here today to honor 3 of our former X-15 pilots, and really am glad to see the turnout of the family and friends and former Dryden employees and former pilots to come here to celebrate with us today. Of course, we're going to honor Bill Dana, Joe Walker, and Jack McKay here today. And it's certainly a distinct privilege to come before you as we award these 3 men astronaut wings for their heroic achievements in the X-15 program. I'm pleased to welcome 3 distinguished X-15 alumni also, men who have accomplished so much for the country: Joe Engle, Bob White, and Neil Armstrong. Also gratified to note that several X-15 engineers and many people that worked on the X-15 program are here today also. We've got John Mateague, one of Dryden's most prolific program managers here, front row, and he was an X-15 flight ops engineer. We have Vince Capasso sitting next to him, worked on the X-15 program also. From the Air Force, X-15 flight planner Johnny Armstrong. They're going to say a few things a little bit later, I think. So, most of all, I'd like to welcome the families of the 3 honorees, and please forgive me for leaving out many of the names. But they're represented here today, as Steve mentioned, by Judy and Matt Dana, Sherry Lowe for the McKays, and Grace and Jim Walker. In fact, I'm told there's many McKays here, and there's also many Walkers here, and they plan to have a family reunion to coincide with the event. And I think that's just great. As we mark these historic flights, the last of which happened 37 years ago, I think it's important that we pause and reflect on the X-15 pilots and what they endured as a group in order to appreciate the specific accomplishments of the men we are honoring today. Everyone remembers the technical milestones of the program, but it's easy to forget the hardships required to realize these outstanding events. To get the flavor of the experience, there's no better source than Dryden's legendary pilot and engineer, Milt Thompson, who flew the X-15 14 times himself, as well as just about everything else that we had at Dryden at the time. Milt has left behind a great account of his first time aboard the X-15, or the Black Bull, as he preferred to call it, due to its power and unpredictability. He recalled the day in October 1963 when, strapped into the X-15 under the belly of the B-52 mothership, he awaited the all-clear from NASA 1. Everything looks good here, he was told. We'll call that 3, 2, 1, launch, said Thompson. And as he said this, he thought to himself, the Bull and I are off on our journey. At this point, said Thompson, I really got a shock. The launch was like being shot downward out of a cannon. It was a real jolt. No one warned me about the severity of the launch. I guess it seems that the more seasoned pilots had become used to it and began to think of it as routine, so they never mentioned it to me. Then came the engine firing. It lit off successfully, and then I received my second surprise. The force of the engine forced my body back hard into the seat and the headrest and effectively pinned me in that position for the duration of the powered flight. Because of being forced upright in the seat, my instrument scan pattern that I had developed in the simulator was useless. I had to devise a new scan pattern in real time. To compound the problem, the pressure suit helmet had very little clearance in the small canopy. So when I attempted to move my head, I usually got hung up in the canopy pad and structure. Nevertheless, at 73,000 feet, just 122 seconds after launch, Thompson shut down the engine and began to glide home. Then the moment of truth, the dead stick landing. I had made it to Edwards in reasonably good shape, but now I was going to have to make that honest-to-God dead stick landing. I only had one chance. If I screwed up, I lost the airplane and maybe more. The initial touchdown was very smooth until the nose came down. The nose came down with a vengeance. For a moment, I thought the nose gear had failed as the nose slammed down on the runway. I did not realize how close the cockpit was to the ground in the landing attitude. I thought my butt was going to scrape the land. It was a real joke, about 8 Gs in the cockpit. Milt went on. The one thing that impressed me on this flight was the amount of physical effort required to fly this airplane. I was really exhausted after the flight. Some of the exhaustion was obviously due to mental stress, but much of it was due to the muscular exertion required to manipulate all the controls and fly the aircraft while fighting the G-forces and the resistance of the pressure suit. Following that flight, I immediately embarked on a physical fitness program to get back into shape. Milt had a way with words. Flying the X-15 was definitely not a piece of cake. After the flight, I felt like I had put in a 12-hour day digging ditches. I commented to the engineers after the flight that this was the first aircraft that I'd flown that I was happy to shut the engine off. Bill Dana always loved this comment and quoted it many times in his talks about the X-15. Yet, despite the shared experiences the X-15 pilots expressed by Milt, 3 men about to receive astronaut wings today were very different individuals. Joseph Walker, born in 1921, grew up in Washington, Pennsylvania in the 1920s and 30s, and attended Washington and Jefferson College, where he earned a BS in physics. He flew P-38s in World War II and won the Distinguished Flying Cross. Joe began working for NASA's predecessor, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, just after the war. During his 21-year research pilot career, he flew a hangar full of aircraft, including the D558 Skystreak, the D558 Skyrocket, the X-1, the X-3, the X-4, the X-5 experimental airplanes, as well as the Century Series F-100, F-101, F-102, and F-104 fighters. He also piloted the B-47 bomber and the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, a ship which Neil Armstrong has more than a passing familiarity. During his X-15 career, Joe Walker flew the aircraft over a period of 41 months. He had the fastest flight on the standard X-15, 4,104 miles an hour. The highest flight of all, 354,300 feet. And he also made the first government flight. The award of wings to Joe Walker is especially sweet. Fellow pilots noticed that the occasionally mercurial Walker expressed irritation at times over all the attention the Mercury and Gemini astronauts received. In fact, Walker got into it one day with Gus Grissom. Joe reminded Gus that the differences between the X-15 and the Redstone rocket were not really that great. And actually, they balanced out. 65,000 pounds of thrust in the X-15, 76,000 pounds of thrust in the Redstone. A throttle in the X-15, none in the Redstone. A pilot who flew the boost profile in the X-15, a pilot who went along for a ride in the Redstone. A maximum speed and altitude of 45,020 miles an hour and 67 miles for Walker's vehicle, and 5,180 miles per hour and 116 miles for Grissom's. So today, about 44 years later, this good-humored exchange, the argument is settled. Joe will join Gus in the astronaut corps, which would give Joe's family particular satisfaction as he receives his wings today. John B. McKay, native son of Old Dominion, started his life in December 1922 in Portsmouth, Virginia. He served in the Second World War as a naval aviator in the Pacific and received the Air Medal and the Presidential Unit Citation. He then earned a degree in aeronautical engineering from the Virginia Polytechnic Institute in 1950. McKay started flying for the NACA in 1951 at Langley and soon transferred to what became NASA Dryden. Over the course of 20 years, he piloted a succession of prominent aircraft, including the D-558 Skystreak, the D-558 Skyrocket, the X-1B, the X-1E, and the Century Series fighters, the F-100, the F-102, the F-104, and the F-107. Jack McKay had the distinction of flying the X-15 program longer than any other pilot, from October 1960 to September 1966, and during 4 different phases of the program: the checkout of the LR-11 rocket engine, the research phase of the program, the scientific experiment phase, and the X-15A2 envelope expansion phase. He flew to Mach 5.65 and to an altitude of 295,600 feet. He also accumulated more rocket flights than any American pilot other than Scott Crossfield, flying an astounding 42 flights of them in those rocket airplanes before his first X-15 encounter. Milt Thompson recalled that Jack had a pretty good sense of humor and originated several good one-liners that have been quoted at Dryden for years. One of Milt's favorites was a comment Jack made during a weather flight. He was flying a weather flight, and the weather was very marginal all along the X-15 flight track. Jack described the weather and cloud cover to NASA 1 at each of the emergency lakes and at the launch lake as he flew up range. The weather did not appear to be adequate for an X-15 flight that day, but NASA 1 could not get Jack to state that explicitly. Finally, in exasperation, NASA 1 asked Jack for a bottom-line assessment. His response: "Any improvement will be for the better." Jack, said Milt, was a true Southern gentleman. Bill Dana started his pilot's journey in Pasadena, California, and grew up in Bakersfield. He graduated from West Point in 1952, served in the U.S. Air Force as a fighter pilot for 4 years, and then earned a master's degree in aeronautical engineering from the University of Southern California. He began work at the then high-speed flight station on October 1, 1958, the very day that NASA was created. Appropriately, Bill started his career as an X-15 simulator pilot, and also as one of 3 pilots. Neil Armstrong and Milt Thompson were the others, who were consultants on the U.S. Air Force Dinosaur space plane program. A very full career followed for Bill. He not only gained prominence flying the X-15, but at the same time was one of the busiest lifting body pilots here at Dryden. Bill flew 4 of the 6 versions of these small wingless and often dangerous to fly vehicles: the M2F1, the M2F3, the HL-10, and the X-24B. The rest of his career reads like an encyclopedia of Dryden's major programs. He flew the F-100 variable stability research aircraft, the Advanced Fighter Technology Integration F-16 aircraft, the Highly Integrated Digital Electronic Controller, or HIDEC F-15 program, and the F-18 High Angle of Attack Research Vehicle program, or the HARV program as we all know it. In all, he logged more than 8,000 hours flight time in almost 40 years, flying about 50 types of aircraft. On the X-15, Bill had the distinction of being one of only 3 pilots to exceed 300,000 feet altitude, and he became the last man to fly Milt Thompson's notorious Black Bull. We at Dryden know Bill Dana for his wicked, almost instant wit. One example involved Milt and Bill, and Milt recounted that on one trip I had driven up to Seattle in my Jaguar Roadster, and Bill had flown up. He asked to borrow my car one evening to tour the town. I gave him the keys and told him to check the gas. He stopped at the nearest gas station and told the attendant to fill it up. The attendant checked the oil and told Bill that nothing showed up on the dipstick. Bill told him to put in a quart of oil. He did it and checked it again. Still nothing. Bill told him to put in another quart, which he did. Another check showed nothing on the dipstick. After 2 more quarts, the dipstick finally showed a trace of oil on the bottom tip. Bill said, "That's enough." The next day, Bill was complaining to me about paying $2 for gas and $4 for oil. I realized that I had forgotten to tell him that the car held 13 quarts of oil, and I routinely ran it 5 or 6 quarts low before I filled it up. He accused me of intentionally setting him up to get a free oil. Bill Thompson fittingly described Bill Dana as an excellent pilot and a person of high moral character and integrity. And I think we would all agree with that. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes my remarks about the X-15 and these three astronauts who flew it. To the families of Dana, Walker, and McKay, please accept my profound appreciation for loaning us Bill, Joe, and Jack during the X-15 program. Time and again, we ask them to risk their lives for the very highest calling that life offers, for the advancement of human knowledge. And they never let us down. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Those are great. And now I'd like to present three engineers who worked on the X-15 program: Johnny Armstrong, John McTeague, and Vince Capasso, who will reminisce about the three pilots being honored here today. Johnny, you were in the Air Force flight planner for the X-15. Would you tell us some of your recollections, please? If you would, come on up. Electronic device.
I do briefings. There's a shorter phrase for the description that you just heard about the X-15 flights. Walt Disney had a good name for that. It was an e-ticket ride. For those of you old enough to know what e-tickets are. I've got 5 minutes to tell you about the three guys that flew three flights that qualified them for astronaut wings. And each flight was 10 minutes, so I've got a problem on that. The machine they flew in, okay, X-15. The flight control surfaces that they directed aerodynamically, that doesn't do that. I got to release it. Rolling tail, both pitch and roll control came from the rolling tail. Rudders, speed brake on the back, and the attitude rockets were on the nose and on the wing. And we'll talk about some of the events that happened to these individuals. The other key point is this lower ventral that we'll talk about during the process. The airplane was designed with these requirements: 250,000 feet and 66 feet per second, Mach 6.6. And this is what they had to do to achieve 50 miles. This was their home, okay? Cockpit of X-15 number 3. Number 3 was different from 1 and 2. It had a modified flight control system, flight control panel, and these were the primary flight instruments. This was the aerodynamic control and ballistic control system out of the atmosphere for this unique airplane. The other airplanes had this bang-bang system over here for up and down, nose right and left, and roll with high peroxide rockets that I showed you out on the wing. One of the items that talks about a lot in these flights is this throttle position here, to the inboard and up forward to get to 100%. It let off at about 40% and up to 100%. And that's the instrument that people had trouble reaching when it got to the shutdown point with the G-forces. So that's where they did all their work. Okay, and this is the set of instruments that they use. This is a typical, not only a typical, this is Bill Dana's altitude flight. It was flown out of Smith's Ranch, which was 290 nautical miles away. And you can see the red is the time that the engine was operating. The rest of it is a glide portion of the flight. The max altitude coming in here, entry completed out this area, and glide back to the base for the unpowered landing. So the airplane was launched from B-52 at 45,000 feet, 0.82 Mach number, off the hooks, lighten the engine, pull it up to 11 or 12 degrees angle with attack, maintaining that till you get 2 Gs, completing the rotation up to the climb angle, and in this case it was 39 degrees, and going to a prescribed velocity or time to shut down the engine to achieve the altitude that you're shooting for. And that's the trick. The combination of that pitch angle and burnout determined how high you were going to go. And then you do the experiment as you get up, and the Q is low. In this case, Bill was trying to catch some micrometeorites, and a wingtip pod that was on the edge of the wing, and peek it out at peak altitude, and then performing the reentry. So within the first 40 seconds on an altitude flight, you had fixed your ground track. Your heading was now fixed. You were now ballistic. You couldn't change anything. So real critical that you maintain that heading during that rotation. Depending on the altitude, this was the range of climb angle that we went through in the program. And then you shut down the engine, as I said, based on the peak altitude. The engine burn time was usually between 80 and 85 seconds. The thrust was 60,000 pounds. And that was one of the problems. We never were really sure exactly what the thrust level was going to be on any flight. This is the sensitivity for those parameters in terms of engine burn time, and then the pitch angle in terms of if you're off 1 degree, you're going to miss your altitude by 7,500 feet. If you're off 1 second of burn time, you're going to miss the altitude. So what am I leading up to? Probably some miss altitude stories. Okay? Sorry about that. So, flying X-15 altitude flights is just about as humbling as playing golf. You know, you think you got the fixer, you can hit the fairway, and all of a sudden, zap, you're slicing and you're way out in the rough. And so this happens quite often in the program. And these guys were, you know, very professional, and they took pride in any flight plan of doing exactly what it said, get the data they wanted to, and they were a little bit sensitive after the fact that they didn't do it. And I'm afraid to tell you that we didn't really let up on them and be kind to them after the fact. And that is still effective today. Okay, here's Joe's flight. You know, guys, I've got a script here that I've got to make some quotes from. I have the luxury of having access to all the original X-15 records that I gathered during my participation. Okay. So Joe's flight went that high. He was launched out of Delamar, about 180 nautical miles away. In the air in 9 minutes and 44 seconds. And his flight purpose was kind of significant. It was to expand the envelope and the altitude buildup with that ventral off. So you see the lower ventral is off. That was usually jettisoned on final approach. Now, a couple of smart flight planners, Bob Hoy for the Air Force and Dick Dave for the NASA, had studied this and concluded that the airplane flew better, was more controllable, and more forgiving if you lost your dampers with the lower ventral off. Like anything else, the X-15 was a compromise design, and that lower ventral provided the stability at the high speed and low angles of attack. So this was one of those flights to do that and prove that. And he did some piggyback experience all the way, along the way. Two other flights that Joe flew that went above 50 miles are shown there. And these were about as high as we were going to try to take the machine. You were coming up to your G limit that we established for flight planning, for safety, the angle of attack, and that was about as high as we were going to go. And that flight there was flown 42 years ago yesterday. Amazing. Okay, here's some comments from the radio in real time. Normally, the pilot claims to be so busy he doesn't have time to look out. Joe looked out the window. He says, "The moon sure," this is right over the radio, the moon sure looks pretty, but I couldn't get my hands on the throttle for being." So this explained now why Joe went high. Okay, right there in real time. He wanted to set it the stage that he knew he had something to deal with after he got back. His other comment there was, this was at the post flight, while I was doing this experiment, some kind of searchlight was shining in the right-hand side of the cockpit instead of the left. I discovered it was the moon shining. Half moon, by the way, a line was straight on the disk rather than convex or concave. Now that's a test pilot talking, okay? There was no trouble with visibility. I was able to view Los Angeles and the Antelope Valley and the base continuously through the descending part of the flight. Well, this is not a good reflection on the flight planner. He shouldn't have had enough time to make that kind of time. He had considerable rocket plane experience before he got into the X-15. An example of his flexibility is this. One day on one of those high altitude flights, over the radio, I heard Joe having a laugh with himself. Okay, ho, 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 ho. And you probably recognize the laugh that Joe had. It was very unique. And he says, ha, 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 it's backwards. Uh-oh. His side-swept needle was backwards. And this was with the number 1 airplane, and he was manually control it and create it to go divergent. He learned that real quick, found out what was going on, and flew the needle backwards to get it to fly right. That's a flexible test pilot. Oh, he was a real old pro, and he helped this greenhorn flight planner kind of get his feet on the ground and learn the trade. And it was a real loss to me when we did lose Joe, and I kind of countered with that because I went out and planted me a fruitless mulberry tree out in the backyard. That tree is now this big and covers the biggest part of my house. Jack McKay. He was unique. What you saw was what you got with Jack. There was no put on at all. And that's what was his flight conditions, 295, 600 feet, which was an overshoot more than what Joe had overshot the previous flight, okay? He had a long flight, 11 minutes, 56 seconds. He was carrying scanners and doing other research experiments. He wasn't as precise a flyer as some of the other pilots, but Jack was always referred to as a good stick and rudder man. He could bring an airplane back whenever it wasn't feeling well. And as a matter of fact, he did on 3 occasions make emergency landings at the uprange lakes. And then, of course, one time he gear failed on ship 2. He rolled over, got trapped underneath, and they had to dig Joe out from under in the cockpit to get him on his way again. Both the airplane and Joe and Jack were injured, but both got well and flew again. Okay, Mr. Dana. You're fair game. Joe's overshoot was even higher than both of the other two, okay? So he has 306-900. It's not flight out of Smith's Ranch. I think I said the other. Here's some quotes for him, and this is in real time over the radio. From NASA One is, we got you going through 280,000 feet now. Dana, how about that? Further on down, it says, NASA One says, right on track, Bill. Looking real good. We have you peaking out at 310,000 feet. Dana comes back. Is Jack McKay sending his congratulations? Okay, that wasn't his only sin on that flight. He did a zero-G demonstration. He didn't have any ends with him like the spaceship guys did. So here's his quote at the post-flight on this event. At shutdown, my checklist exploded. I don't know how it came out of that alligator clip, but anyway, I had 22 pages of checklists floating around the cockpit with me. It was a great deal like trying to read Shakespeare sitting under a maple tree in October in a high wind. I didn't know you read Shakespeare. I saw only one instrument at a time for the remainder of the ballistic portion, so we may have to get a safety latch on that thing. Once again, after landing that rascal, the alligator clip was locked tight, and it took me 10 to 15 minutes to get it open. So I don't know how these pages came out of the checklist, but there they were. And these will be in the camera film, which I think we can probably sell to Walt Disney for a great deal. And then he comes in and land, and normally the pilot's all happy, and then he has to flip to page 16 to go through the checklist. And this was on the radio. Thank you, Pete Knight was the controller. Pete, since my page 16 is somewhere down on the bottom of the floor, maybe you could help me go over the checklist. Well, I had the privilege of working even longer with Bill, and we became really good friends, and we went through the lifting body programs together. And we've had a special relationship throughout the years, since both of us still come out here daily, and we get together and reflect quite a bit. So there's Dana's famous saying I heard lots of time on the landing. Thank you, folks.
Can you hear me? I was told I had a 3-minute speech, so I didn't write anything down except a couple of notes about some things. I did something last week. I got together with Bruce Peterson for a meeting, and he filled me in with a few ideas of things to talk about. One of them has to do with just basically ought to talk about the general, what an X-15 ops engineer had to do, and some of those kind of things. Basically, I don't think we can fly the X-15 today with all the restrictions on it. One of the things that we had a hydrogen peroxide pump, turbo pump for our fuels, and the seal around it is being powered by superheated steam, and the seal around it would go bad occasionally, and the inspector go in with a mirror around it when we were in igniter idle, which was basically just up ready to fire. And he'd come in and say, "Oh, I got a little, looks like a little leak there, John, come on out and look at it." So I go on out, here we are, just about ready for that thing to fire, and you get in the back end, and you stick your head in by the engine, and you look all around it, and you take a mirror, and you took a mirror to look at it because the superheated steam would condense on the mirror surface. And you say, "Oh, I don't see it. Show me where it is again." And then you'd look, and if you saw it, then you'd call it off, and you'd have to go change the engine out. But they wouldn't let anybody nowadays get in by a rocket engine and stick his head in there. They send you to the local loony bin, I think, nowadays. But anyways, that's some of the things we did. But then I had 26 flights with number 3, and then turned it over to Vince for number 3. I didn't have too much to do with Bill Dana, but I do have something to give Bill. Bring it up here. I had a funny thing happen to me this morning on the way in. I stopped by and saw Bill Dana. And he said something about he wished he would get some mail from the past. I can't remember the exact words on that, Bill, but he said you'd like to have some stuff from the past. So I have something here from the past. This was found in Roy Bryant's archives. It's to William H. Dana, in recognition of 30 years of flying the F-104 flight vehicle, 25th of March 1960 to 23rd of March 1990, longest in the fleet, and signed by Ben Rich. But then he had, Bruce Peterson asked me to discuss something about Neo's flight, since it was in number 3 airplane, and it's the only one that the little old ladies in Pasadena ever had a chance to look at. I ought to explain that a little bit. I was the ops engineer, and Neo was from the ops side, and responsible for seeing that the adaptive control system worked right, and he followed that diligently. And coming back from one of the flights, he decided he wanted to see whether part of the system was working correctly, and that it would stop the over pulling of the stick. And he kept pulling back on the stick after he entered, and zoomed back up again until he didn't have enough air to control it again, and ended up over Pasadena, and he glided on back in. And he was supposed to land on North Lake bed, but he landed on the South Lake bed. Yeah, it was close. And Bruce said he went down to look at it, and he said right there where the ditch was, right 2 feet the other side of it, where the skid mark showed up. So Bruce said, be sure to mention that and try to explain why it happened. And Neil was just trying to be his scientist self again and check everything out. Then I ought to explain something about Jack McKay here. Jack made a landing, and this is Bruce's input. He had an engine out over Delamar and landed at Delamar. And Bruce was flying chase, and he said to Jack, Jack, you're cutting it short, extend it a little bit. He says, it's okay, Bruce, got it. He got closer. He says, Jack, you gotta slow her down. No, I got it, Bruce. He sailed over the end of the lake bed and down to the middle of the lake bed and finally touched down and he skidded right on off the end of the lake bed and to the side. But I had it, he said. But let me also explain something about Jack. Jack and I flew quite a bit together. He would take me up in a G-33 and we go up a range and look at I had Boy Scouts for 18 years, so he'd take me up range to see how the lake beds were and how the passes were, because I usually went up on the 4th of July and there was usually a lot of snow still in the passes. And Jack would take me up and we'd scout the things. There's one time he took me up, it was right after an X-15 flight party. And I wasn't feeling that good that day. And Jack we were going around Mount Whitney, and about the 3rd time around Mount Whitney, I said, Jack, you say to do it one more time, and I'm going to have to clean this cockpit. And he straightened it out, and we came on home by going down the Kern River Valley and checking out the path going down it. But anyway, I've flown with Jack a lot, and he was probably one of the smoothest pilots I've flown with. He came in a DC-3 on the lake bed out here, and he'd fly 2 feet off the ground for a mile or so, and sometimes I wouldn't even know when the main gear touched. He was that good of a pilot. I really enjoyed flying with him, and I really miss him because I did enjoy his company. Then we get to Joe. Now Joe was particular about how the cockpit was set up. And we were going through an overhaul, and he wanted some instruments changed from one place to another. You know how pilots are, they like to have that cockpit look the way they like to have it look. And so he had me change some instruments around to different places, and I had a new panel made of the cockpit to put in place and put it back. I had it all ready to go, and I said, Joe, come on down and take a look at the cockpit I got set up for you, see if it's what you want. And Joe, with his happy grin and he always had, and he came on down to look at it, and I'll never forget the look on his face. It was shock. He looked at it, and then he knew he had it. I had painted the cockpit pink. We used to call it different kind of pink. I can't use those words nowadays, but it was a pink one here. He knew he'd be had it, and he started laughing. But along those lines, and with Joe liking to backpack and so forth, I have for Grace, I run across this about 6 months ago. It's a film of when I had Boy Scouts up at 4th Lake. And Joe was up there with the boys, and this is a picture on this film of Joe and the boys at 4th Lake. Well, except for rambling on and talking about different things, I would like to say one thing that I felt about how we all were. We were a family. We all were looking out for each other. We didn't depend upon committees to look out for us. Each person took personal responsibility for his job to do it. And I don't know how you get that in this culture we have nowadays. It was a different time, different place, and people have to live with what they have. I felt that I lived through probably the best years of my life here from 1952 until I retired. And I'm sure each new person coming in now and seeing the new technologies will feel the same way. So, thank you.
Well, how do you follow that? Anyway, it's light on that's right in my poor eyes. It's one of the things that comes with getting older. As the others have said today, X-15 pilots were very professional and preparing for and completing flights in any airplane as well as the X-15. That was a pleasure for me to have worked with them over the years. Of course, I was the ops engineer on Ship 3 when Bill made his flight. I can remember the preparations for the flight. As ops engineer, I was responsible for getting it ready. Flight plan called for the altitude of 367,000, just over that mark, and we all liked Bill and wanted to make sure that he got there. Jack Koff, the flight planner, I remember him coming to me and said, "Don't short him on fuel. We don't want him to have an early engine shutdown." I think Bill himself mentioned he'd like to be sure he had a full bag for that flight. Now, when we fueled the airplane for the liquid ammonia, when we put that on board, you'd have to raise the rear wheels of the B-52 a little bit to level the X-15 to get a full load of fuel. So to make sure it was full for that flight, we arranged to get it up a couple more inches. Similarly, the liquid oxygen was loaded on the ground, but then topped off from the B-52 until the top-off was complete just before pressurization. But to be sure he had a full load, I arranged with the launch panel operator that we'd keep putting liquid oxygen in until he called pressurization. Well, the net result of that was that he launched, the engine lit, got off on his flight just as scheduled, until he got to the 81-second point where the engine was supposed to shut off, and it kept running. Finally, at 80, what was it, 81? No, 82.8 seconds, I think it was. He finally got the engine shut off. That contributed to a little bit of altitude overshoot, as we heard earlier. Something which I think he still gets kidded about. Let's see. Of course, the first question they asked me after the flight was, "How'd you make it run so long?" And the obvious answer was, "You guys told me to fill it up." I did. Okay, now Jack, I recall Jack being a very strong person physically as well as an excellent pilot. And the reason I brought that up is because on one of his X-15 flights, he reported in the post-flight that the speed brakes were hard to operate. It took a lot of force. So after the flight, I got together with the crew and I said, "Well, let's check those speed brakes out real good, make sure everything's operating all right, and also make sure that nothing's bent in the linkage that operates them." And everything checked out fine. Nothing bent, everything worked just the way it should. So then on a hunch, we went and checked the simulator. Now there's an orifice in the hydraulic lines to the speed brakes. The simulator was slightly bigger than the one on the airplane, which meant they operated a little bit faster. Jack had picked that up. That's where his takes extra force to operate them came from. Another thing that I used to also go out and at the point of touchdown in lake bed, we'd throw a smoke grenade to, if they could pick up at altitude, have a point to aim for. Now Jack often landed just a little bit short of the touchdown point. Now for those of us who threw the smoke grenades, this got to be quite a thrill and exciting because you had to sneak out from behind that smoke and see where he was. Very little steering on the airplane once it was on the ground, so we had to make darn sure we weren't in his way. And Joe, I remember the big grin that he always had. And like the other the other pilots that we've talked about, he liked to backpack too. Bill and I have been backpacking quite a few times, but never had the pleasure of being with Joe or Jack. Joe, of course, would check out the lake beds for us, or not the lake beds, the lakes in the Sierras. Kind of give us a comment on how much snow there was and what it looked like. And he was also known if he had some friends there at the lake, he'd take a real close look. And I think some of you know what I mean by a real close look. Excuse me. Oh, I can't read it. Anyway, really like Joe. Oh, I remember the other thing I was going to comment on. One of the X-15 flight days, we had a Marine pilot assigned to us for a while, and he went up, first aircraft up to check the conditions uprange. And when he called in, he commented that Joe was supposed to join up with him, and he wondered if we knew where he was. Now, they were both flying F-104s. And before NASA 1 could respond, there was that familiar chuckle, and right behind you. And I kind of figured that was the fighter pilot's gotcha. So, once again, it's been a pleasure to be here today and talk a little bit about my three friends. And congratulations to them. And also a pleasure to work with them and all the other X-15 pilots over the years. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Johnny and Vince, for those great reflections. That was very good. That was very good. A prominent part of the genealogy of the Boeing company is the North American Aircraft company that the aviation part that built the X-15 is a proud part of the Boeing heritage nowadays. And I'd like to introduce my friend from the Boeing company, Steve Oswald, who is the Boeing Vice President, Program Director for the Space Shuttle. And if that isn't enough, he's also an astronaut and a former Rear Admiral. So if you'd like, if you'd please welcome Steve, come on up and say a few words here.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here to represent Mike Mott and the Boeing Company, and I've got to tell you, in these days of heightened awareness of corporate ethics and those kinds of things, it's really not easy to give money away these days when you're dealing with the government. And I really appreciate Steve, your patience and your help in getting this done, and Dennis. Because it's certainly the right thing to do for Boeing as the beneficiaries of all the expertise that came out of North American aviation in Rockwell, manifested itself in the space shuttle orbiter that we fly today, and all the great work that all the X-15 teams did in bringing that program home. And just a personal sea story a little bit, and I'm thinking I'm representing Mr. Reedy here just a little bit. We landed 10 years ago last January out here on runway 22 in the Space Shuttle Discovery on our first flight. So after we had gone through all the post-flight stuff, our commander, Ron Gravy, who was an Air Force colonel, decided that both Bill and I, who were naval reservists, should receive our Navy Naval Aviator astronaut wings, which would have been a first in the astronaut business. So he took that to the chief of the astronaut office, Ronald's predecessor, who happened to be a naval aviator. He said, not only no, but hell no, it's not going to happen. You guys are reservists. And so we went through, Ron took it uphill, and about 6 months later, Bill and I were in the Pentagon and got our astronaut wings from the Vice Chief of Naval Operations. So I think Mr. Reedy was living through his experience, and if you think about the bureaucracy that exists within the Navy, and it's huge, that the Navy was able to get past that in 6 or 7 months It's kind of incredible that it's taken NASA 40 years or so. But it's a pleasure again for me to be here personally, and for Boeing to be able to participate in this really wonderful event, to put an excellent block that should have been there a long time ago. Steve, back to you.
Are you saying it's easier to work for the Navy? Okay. Again, thanks, Steve, and thanks for helping us out and having Boeing help sponsor this event. Really do appreciate it. Now what I'd like to do is present a short film about the X-15, and in this film you'll be able to recognize what Johnny had quoted from Bill earlier.
Flight, North American, X-15. No other aircraft before or since has come close to approaching the truly awesome performance of this airplane. Under a joint NASA, Air Force, and Navy program, it was designed to explore the unknowns of hypersonic and exo-atmospheric flight, controlled flight, speeds in excess of Mach 5, and to altitudes in excess of 250,000 feet. Its design was tailored to permit it to fly in this extreme environment, to withstand the searing, friction-generated 1,200-degree temperatures of re-entry. Its outer skin was fabricated from a special chrome-nickel alloy called Inconel X, to enable the pilot to maintain precise control as it exited the atmosphere. Its nose and wingtips were configured with reaction controls, small hydrogen peroxide jet thrusters to provide pitch, yaw, and roll control. Finally, it was designed around a mammoth, single-chamber, throttleable rocket engine, the 57,000-pound thrust XLR-99. Because of delays in its development, however, the first 25 flights were made with an interim pair of upgraded 4-chamber XLR-11s, providing a modest 16,000 pounds of thrust. As North American's pilot, Crossfield's job was to demonstrate the airworthiness of the X-15 and the proper functioning of its systems up to speeds approaching Mach 3. These initial tests were not without their hazards. Shortly after launch on the third powered flight, for example, an engine explosion rocked the airplane. Unable to jettison his fuel and LOX, Crossfield was forced to make an emergency landing with a heavy load of propellants that broke the back of the airplane just behind the cockpit as he touched down. He was uninjured, and the number 2 X-15 was repaired and restored to flight status. Meanwhile, as flight testing proceeded, the first XLR-99 was delivered to Edwards for ground tests. In June of 1960, Crossfield was seated in the cockpit of the number 3 X-15 when a malfunctioning valve caused a catastrophic explosion. Remarkably, once again, he was uninjured, and the airplane was rebuilt. Crossfield completed North American's program when he demonstrated the successful operation of the engine during 3 flights in November and December of 1960. During these flights, however, he'd been contractually limited to speeds just below Mach 3, and thus neither the airplane nor the engine had been taxed to anything close to its full potential, as a small group of government test pilots turned to the job of expanding the X-15's envelope. They included NASA's Joe Walker, Jack McKay, and Neil Armstrong, Air Force Majors Bob White, Bob Rushworth, and Navy Commander Forrest Peterson. The X-15's awesome potential was finally unleashed in the spring of 1961, when within the brief span of 8 months between March and November of that year, it became the first airplane in history to exceed Mach 4, 5, and 6. The man who made those flights, Major Bob White, was also the first to fly it in space, as he climbed above 314,000 feet the following year. And in August of 1963, NASA's Joe Walker took it all the way up to its peak altitude, 354,000 feet, more than 67 miles above the Earth's surface, a record which, to this day, still stands for a winged aircraft. But the program was concerned with much more than dazzling ultra-performance records. Throughout this early phase, the X-15's pilots collected mountains of critical research data on hypersonic stability and control, heating rates, and flight loads, while demonstrating that they could fly a winged vehicle out of the atmosphere, transition from conventional aerodynamic to reaction controls, and then return, and by means of energy management techniques, glide down to precision landings. As the program moved into the mid-60s, its focus shifted toward using the airplanes as test beds for more generic research on hypersonic phenomena, and to carry a wide variety of space science experiments into the near space environment. By that time, a new group of pilots was coming on board, including the Air Force's Captain Joe Engle, and Majors Pete Knight and Mike Adams, as well as NASA's Bill Dana and Milt Thompson. Each of their missions typically lasted only about 10 minutes, but the mental and physical demands imposed on them during that brief span were truly prodigious. On a typical altitude mission, for example, as the pilot lit the engine, he was slammed back into his seat by an instantaneous 2G acceleration. Pulling into a climb, within mere seconds, he was passing through Mach 3. While being subjected to ever-increasing G-forces during the climb, he had to maintain extraordinarily precise control. Each additional degree of climb angle beyond the planned profile, for example, could produce an increase of 7,500 feet in altitude. Engine burnout occurred 82 seconds after ignition, as he was passing through 150,000 feet at Mach 5. Almost instantaneously, the 4G loads pressing him against his seat plummeted to zero, an experience prompting Milt Thompson to quip that the X-15 was the only airplane he ever flew, where he was glad when the engine quit. In sharp contrast to the tremendous forces which only moments before had pressed so heavily against him, he experienced the freedom of zero gravity as he coasted over the top of his flight path at 280,000 feet. About 3 minutes after exiting the atmosphere, he re-entered it at Mach 5 and started his pull-out at about 150,000 feet. Once again, he had to maintain incredibly precise control of the airplane as the G-forces built up to more than 5 Gs before he came level at 80,000 feet and began to set up his approach into Edwards, about 60 miles distant. Now, his focus was on energy management. Technique and skill were critical here, for if he dissipated his speed and altitude too rapidly, he'd fall short of the base. Too slowly, and he'd overshoot it. As he neared Edwards, he banked into a 360-degree spiral approach to the lake bed. The X-15 touched down at about 230 miles per hour. Not all missions went so smoothly. In November of 1962, Jack McKay lost power shortly after launch in the No. 2 aircraft and was forced to attempt a high-speed emergency landing at nearly 300 miles per hour on Mud Lake in Nevada. At touchdown, the left landing skid collapsed and the craft tumbled violently across the lake bed. Though seriously injured, McKay recovered to fly again. And while the twisted mass of the airplane appeared to be a total loss, it was rebuilt as the X-15A2. Configured with a pair of jettisonable external propellant tanks that would nearly double the engine's burn time and thereby enable it to reach for higher speeds, it was also covered with a thermal protection coating to enable it to withstand the 2,000-degree temperatures predicted at those speeds. On October 3rd, 1967, Major Pete Knight launched from the B-52, lit his engine, and began to climb, consuming its propellants at a rate of 12,000 pounds per minute. The big engine drained the external tanks in just 67 seconds. And accelerating upward through 70,000 feet at Mach 2, Knight felt a sharp bump as they were jettisoned. Coming level at about 100,000 feet, he flew a perfect profile to a speed Mach 6.7, 4,520 miles per hour. Flying at a speed more than twice that of a .50 caliber bullet, he was unaware of the ordeal endured by his craft. The thermal protection coating had failed as temperatures exceeded 3,000 degrees, and a dummy ramjet attached to the ventral tail had literally burned off, leaving a hole through which torch-like air was channeled into the X-15's tail section, where it burned out pressurization lines and electrical wiring that prevented him from jettisoning his propellants and lowering his landing flaps. By dint of exceptional piloting skill, he managed to bring the stricken airplane in for a safe landing. Charred by its wild ride through a hypersonic inferno, the X-15A2 would never fly again. And Pete Knight's record still remains the highest speed at which any man has ever flown in an airplane. When Bill Dana climbed out of the cockpit for the final time in October of 1968, it marked the end of a truly remarkable era in flight research. During 199 flights over a nearly 10-year span, the three X-15s had completely redefined the envelope as they mapped out the frontiers of hypersonic flight. 12 pilots had flown the X-15. 8 of them had qualified for astronauts' wings by flying an airplane in space. Sadly, one of them, Major Mike Adams, had lost his life when in November of 1967, the number 3 X-15 departed from controlled flight, broke apart during re-entry. A tragic loss that underscored the risks inherent in flight research. His death marred what is otherwise regarded as, by far, the most successful flight research program in history. Not only did it make major contributions to the more celebrated Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs, the knowledge gained from it made it possible for designers to proceed with the development of a true orbiting spaceship. When the space shuttles touched down on Rogers Dry Lake at Edwards more than a decade later, they were the direct beneficiaries of a small rocket plane that first bridged the gap between air and space.
Agree that these are a handsome group of men here. Hey, Bill, and I have to thank you for the unlimited amount of material that you're able to give us to be able to use for events like this. I do appreciate that. Now I'm pleased to give you 3 former X-15 pilots who need no further introduction. Neil Armstrong, Joe Engle, Bob White. Would you, Neil, would you please come up and do us the honor and tell us some of the things you've got?
What a delight it is to be back. It's always a pleasure to return here to this western shore of Rogers' usually dry lake, and to this always productive research center. In much of society, research means to investigate something you do not know or do not understand. You might do a bit of research to determine what's the best place in Antelope Valley to get a new printer for your computer. Or a student might go to the library or get on the internet to get research material for a class project or document a program. Or you might
you might just do a little research on your own family background, get some history on your family. But research here in this building at Dryden or at Air Force Flight Test Center is quite a different thing. Research here is exploration and discovery. It's investigating something that no one knows or understands. So research is creating new knowledge. And today we honor these three men who did research here. And they flew to some very high altitudes quite a few years ago. They were not involved in such exploits for adventure or to enjoy the view, although those flights, as you could see, were adventurous and the view was spectacular. They rocketed to these extreme altitudes to conduct research, to learn about and advance the world of flight. Joe Walker was my boss and a good friend. Jack McKay taught me everything he knew about flight tests. And I taught Bill Dana everything I knew about flight tests. I cherish my memories of working with each of those three gentlemen, and I am so pleased to be here for this recognition of their remarkable achievements.
Thank you for letting me be here. Thanks for letting me be part of this today. I'm going to steal Neil's first line, and I think probably Bob will too, and that is to express how good it is to be back here at Edwards. It is such a real pleasure to come back and be back here where your heart really never leaves, I don't think. I tried very carefully to think about something I could say that would be short, and it came to me pretty clearly as I was trying to think of things to say, and that was that those of us, when we talk about Edwards to our friends, it's the center of flight test for the world, no question about it. We think we give accolades to the weather that we have here to fly in, we give accolades to the big dry lake bit out there, the greatest landing strip God ever gave to man, and we give accolades to the hardware that we fly. And that's the thing that, those are the things that kind of make center stage. But the key thing that makes these programs go, that makes them work, and I've reflected on this a lot of times in thinking about how well NASA and the Air Force worked on the X-15 program. I've never seen two large agencies work together to be one family like that. And the thing that made it happen, obviously, is the people. Steve, thank you, and thank all of you for mentioning so many of the people who worked on the X-15 program today. I've met so many, I've seen so many of you again, met you again. To try and go through names, I would leave some guys out, I couldn't remember them all, I know. So thank you for mentioning those names, and for all of you names who didn't get mentioned, thank you for making this program and this place what it is. I think the people that I'm talking about here at Edwards are epitomized by the three pilots that we're recognizing today. Now, Bill, you've taken a lot of brunt on jokes today, and you're not done yet. Because Bill and I, as you saw in the film, we're kind of the same vintage. We came on board about the same time. But I remember when I was first assigned to the X-15 program and would come down and fly the simulator and would come down, get ready for flights. I'll admit it now, I really looked hard to see Joe Walker and to see Jack McKay. Just to see him walk down, I'll see him walk out to the air. I could never walk like Joe Walker could. Because he had a silly gait to it, you know, a kind of a farm boy gait. And I came from a farm and I could never walk like Joe did. And I never could develop one-liners like that. Bill, if you'd have been about 10 or 15 years older, you'd have been one of these idols that I had too, and you'd have been, but these guys were my role models. And Bill is a role model because of what they did, the dedication that they had, and the way that they performed the jobs. So I want to thank you for letting me be here today and be part of your program. And I want to say thank you. Thanks Dryden, thanks to the Air Force, thanks to Edwards for being absolutely the greatest flight test center the world will ever know. God bless you all. Thank you.
A rather large speech prepared for, but most of the thunder has been already taken away. Just a few comments. I remember a time when Scott Crossfield and Joe Walker and myself were in the White House, and we presented a model. In fact, I handed it to the president, and I have a picture of that at home. Scotty has a little grin on his face. He's enjoying it. And I have a rather severe look, as though I'm kind of worried whether or not we're displeasing or doing the right thing in handling this situation in that exalted place. And Joe Walker, in that photo, I look at that, and there's that grin, as wide as the Grand Canyon. And I swear, if the president had asked Joe a question at that time, I'm sure Joe would have said, well, Mr. President, you've got a fine dining facility downstairs. Why don't we go downstairs, have a beer, and discuss it? That was Joe. Jack, of all the good things said about him, I can only reiterate, but I would like to emphasize that after that accident, and you saw the accident, it was just an awful accident, and he came back into the program, healed himself, and flew again. And doesn't that say enough for the man? I think so. I didn't get to know Bill very well during the program days because he came on later and then I left. But NASA, NACA, NASA, has a long reputation of producing extraordinarily qualified, well-established, well-principled test pilots and engineers. And I think Bill and the other two exemplify that, and A1, Bill. But another thing that makes this program unique in a way, unlike the Mercury 7 or the astronauts today, they are held together and work together, and it's their assignment, and they live it. But we, frankly speaking, were a rather disparate group. We had a Navy officer, we had Air Force, civilian operation, and of course the government. And we had other forces tending to push and pull on us that eventually led us in different directions. But yes, just as you pointed out, we did work as a team, and it was because of the people. We believed in it, we felt it strongly, and I think that we were the ones that did it. Now, we were 12, 1 dozen. That made me think of Hollywood, which I drove through yesterday getting here. And there was a well-known film about 12 rather bad acting soldiers who were brought together, and were convinced that if they did the right thing, they would be absolved of all their sins. So they trained them very well, and they had a nickname. It was called the Dirty Dozen. And we were a dozen, but I guarantee you the word dirty is not the proper adjective in this case. We look at the time as it passes, and we've all gotten a little older and used the specs and so forth, and there are only 5 of us who are still around from that dozen, all here with one exception. And I think it begins to become such an awesome feeling that there's still, beside that disparate group, there is a strand that goes through the entire 12 that will keep us together forever. There's no way to deny that that's the case. So I salute those 3 guys. They deserve it, and they're among the very best that operated in this organization.
Thanks, Bob, Joe, and Neil, for those wonderful, heartfelt reflections. We really appreciate it. That was really nice. And I'd like everybody to please join me in acknowledging their heroic contributions to American life. And based on what they said, I'd have just thrown a script away. They know a lot better than I do trying to read this thing here. So anyway, now we've finally arrived at why we're all here. So, and that's to give the astronaut wings to 3 of our honorees. We're fortunate to have Kim Rominger from the astronaut office in Johnson with us today. He'll be joined by our own astronaut, Vance Brand, in presenting the first wings to Joe Walker's wife, Grace Weissman, followed by a few words from her son, Jim. Ken, Vance, please.
First of all, I'd like to say it is really an honor for me to be here. And I know it's been years and years and years overdue for this day coming. However, on a more selfish point, I'm glad it did get stayed off a little bit so I could become part of it. Because I got to tell you, as a young kid, I grew up in rural Colorado, and the X-15 pilots were my heroes. They inspired me. Me and my neighbor, who's a pilot, a professional pilot as well, when we were very young, he found out about them and educated me, and they inspired me to become a pilot. And my goal as a young kid was to be a pilot. It was not to be an astronaut. Seeing the X-15, the incredible thrust to weight it has, I've never flown anything yet that had enough thrust to weight. That may have done it if I'd ever gotten to jump in it. But it's truly an honor. And as the Chief of the Astronaut Corps, I've had the pleasure of recognizing folks after they've flown above 50 miles and have become astronauts from different places around the world, from Canada, a couple of Russians, as well as some of our own NASA astronauts, civilian and military alike. But I got to tell you, when Dennis Jenkins came to me and Bill Weedy, who both were very instrumental in making this happen, I absolutely jumped at the opportunity to be part of this because they are very, very due of getting a certificate designating them astronauts as well as wearing astronaut wings. And I just want to express that I'm very honored. I absolutely consider them astronauts, and I'm very envious of the careers they've had because they've been awesome careers and have enabled people like me to fly on the space shuttle. So with that, Vance, what's your number?
Well, I've considered it a great pleasure to work here at Dryden. Been started in aviation, went to space, came back to aviation and space. That's what we have here at Dryden. I think Kent stole my thunder a little bit. I'm from rural Puerto Colorado also, and I think also a beneficiary of the research and the technology that was developed by this program. Back in the 60s, we were all in awe of the program, and we still are. And I wish we could have in the future more programs like this. Although I don't think anybody would ever accept the risk that was accepted back in the 60s during the X-15 program. And that's one reason it accomplished so much. So this is long overdue. It's just a great pleasure to be part of this.
Grace, very nice to meet you. Please, on behalf of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, accept this award with certificate, Joseph A. Walker, NASA Astronaut Wings. And I'd like to read it. It says, in recognition of your 3 qualifying flights into space as an X-15 test pilot, achieving a maximum altitude of 354,200 feet. It's signed by myself as the chief astronaut, the center director here, Kevin Peterson, and Bill Reedy, the Associate Administrator of Space Operations.
These aren't the pin-on type, these are the kind that go on the flight suit, but they are astronaut wings.
It's been a long, long time, and I can prove it, because in the audience today is Miss Allen Matheson, Joe's great-granddaughter.
Sorry I couldn't do the walk for you. I don't really know what it was. I could do John Wayne. My dad's an astronaut. My dad's an astronaut. My dad's an astronaut. It takes some getting used to. You spend a lifetime with one title, and now they've thrown another one out. I don't think I'll lead off with it at parties, though. I mean, you know, it's like, how you doing? My dad's an astronaut. Oh, how you doing? My dad's the Pope. You know, it'll never fly. So I think I'll just put that on the back burner, and I think my father would have been as well. In spite of the anecdote about his contest with Grissom, I think he would have been shy and humble, probably taken this back home and put it away somewhere and never spoken of it again, except maybe to jibe some of the other pilots about it. And however, to our family, it does mean a lot. It's, I don't know if it's been a long time in coming. It's not like we've been waiting for this or anything, but it means a lot, and we are grateful and thankful. And as my brother mentioned, my father, this is why I brought it up, my brother mentioned my father would probably be humble about that, but one of the reasons for that is that he knows this is a group effort. This, even though maybe he was out front and gets an award, it was all the people in the X-15 program. Administration, engineers, technicians, everyone on down the line, men and women that made this happen. And these are the real heroes. And unfortunately, I don't know about things today, whether society could understand that, or whether they might even prosecute what some of these guys did. It was a time, and I don't know if it could ever be equaled. And I lived it as a child, so I kind of missed most of it. I just thought my dad had this cool job. Anyway, we all want to thank you, and we're very appreciative of this.
Okay, next what we want to do is present the wings to Sherry Lowe, who is going to represent the McKay family, and then Sherry will say a few words.
And Sherry, too, I'd like to read this
Again, it's from NASA and presented to John B. McKay, NASA Astronaut Wings, in recognition of your qualifying flight into space as an X-15 test pilot, achieving a maximum altitude of 295,600 feet. Signed by the Chief of the Astronaut Office, myself, Kevin Peterson, the Center Director, and William Reedy, the Associate Administrator for Space Operations. So please accept this on our behalf.
This is Liv going to do it, okay. Could I just have you hold this for a second? You're so So I hope yes, I see I can be heard here. Well, I don't need to tell you what an incredible honor it is to be here today and for our whole family to be here today in honoring our father. And as like Jim was saying, it's just hard to believe that he's an astronaut. My father, the astronaut. I mean, it's just amazing. And we're so thankful and so grateful that you're all here and that we are having this great experience. And let's see, I do want to introduce my siblings. As you know, we have a large family, and I feel so fortunate that I got to be the one to speak today. And anyway, first of all, I just like all my brothers and sisters and their spouses to stand, please. My brother Jim McKay and his wife Nanette, please stand up. And my brother John and his wife Cheryl. Stand. Up a little way, but okay. Now there is Joanne, who second, third in line there, and her husband couldn't be here today, unfortunately. And Mac, would you please stand? And Kathy. My brother Mac and his wife Kathy. And then we have a little ways to go here. There's Mark. Charles. And Susan and her husband Terry. That's just great, and I want to thank all my friends, and we have a few relatives and in-laws here that made the trip out here to the desert to be here. And my brother John, who worked here for 29 years, has a request, and I'm going to honor that. And that is, he would like to see this award, these astronaut wings, dedicated to the engineers, to the mechanics, and to the avionic instrumentation, if I got that right, people who are really responsible for making this program happen in so many ways. Apparently my father had great respect for the people that I just mentioned. He knew that without the mechanics doing their job, that he wouldn't be able to have a safe flight, or without the engineers and avionics people, that he wouldn't even have the opportunity to go up in these planes. So we feel very grateful to these people. And I think if he were here, as John said, he would do the same thing. So, well, what now? What was I going to say? Oh, I do want to say one thing. I just discovered today why there were never any women flying the X-15. And that is, we were out on tour. We all had a very nice tour earlier. And Bill Dana was talking about how they had to sit in the cockpit for about 5 or 6 hours before they were ever launched. And can you imagine any woman sitting in the cockpit for 5 or 6 hours without having to make a trip to the women's room? I just can't imagine it. So I got that answered. But anyway, I just want to tell you a few stories about my father that you may have never heard. I know you all worked with him. Many were close friends of his. And gosh, I wish he could be here to tell them, but he won't. It's just a few. One of them is how he got started in his interest in airplanes. Now, I heard this from my Uncle Jim, who also worked here for many years, and my Aunt Rita, who went on this particular trip with him that I'll tell you about. This is 1927, and my father and his family were living down in the Virgin Islands. My grandfather was a naval officer down there, and so they were stationed there. And anyway, this was after Charles Lindbergh had made his historic flight across the Atlantic. And so Charles Lindbergh was on a publicity tour, and he came through St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, and he and Ann Morrow came in. They landed their seaplane there, and I can't remember why my grandfather photographed them. He was in some official capacity, and I do have a large photograph at home of Lindbergh and his wife. And anyway, he took his 2 boys, the twins, Jack and Jim, out with him and Rita in a boat to meet the seaplane, and they got photographs of Lindbergh, and the kids got to meet Charles Lindbergh. And anyway, the boys went home. They all went home, and pretty soon the boys were making airplanes out of popsicle sticks. That was really something. And then, you know, after a while, they started making airplanes out of balsa wood, and the planes got bigger and bigger, and, well, the rest is history, as you know. And I just like to tell that story because, to me, it illustrates this incredible how interwoven the fabric of aviation history is, and how you can have little boys playing with popsicle sticks, and then later on, you know, they become famous test pilots and now astronauts. And it was about 7 years ago, a friend of mine sent me a photograph. She had been to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and she'd taken pictures of the Spirit of St. Louis, and right close by that was the X-15, and I just think it's quite remarkable. And I just wanted to tell a few other stories about my dad that, you know, some of my siblings mentioned, and I mean, so many of you knew him during the job, and some of you knew him when the job, you know, after the 8 hours was over, whatever. But we lived with him a really long time, and we just have a few stories that you may not have heard. And when I think of him, you know, the thing that comes to mind to me is this quote from Helen Keller, that famous quote, "Life is a great adventure, or else it's just nothing." And I think for my dad, that was really true. He just had a great sense of adventure, a real passion for life, and a real playful attitude about it all too. You know, many of you know how he liked to joke, how he liked to play practical jokes, etc. And it was just something to live with him, and especially 30 years later after he's passed away, just to realize at a deep core level the kind of person that he was. I'm just amazed. I can hardly believe it. And I just remember how he loved the great outdoors, how he loved to camp, and he'd take my brothers and other friends up. They'd climb Mount Whitney. For the longest time, I thought they just sort of hung out there, you know, at the portal or something. But, you know, I learned later that they really did climb to the top of Mount Whitney, you know, every few years, 14,000 feet. I mean, to me, that's really amazing. He just loved picnics. He'd pile us all in the car, and we'd all head out to Bakersfield, you know, on a Sunday afternoon to the Rice Bowl restaurant, which was his favorite Chinese food place. Talking about joking around, my mother told me a story once about, this is 1952, and there was a test pilot's award ceremony at the Antelope Valley Fairgrounds in Lancaster. And so Pancho Barnes was going to be giving out these awards, and my dad and my mom were sitting at this front table. They were sitting with Walt Williams and Helen. They were all having a good time. And anyway, my dad got an award. I don't remember the specifics about what the award was, but he walked by Chuck Yeager and he says, "Sorry, Chuck," as he sat down. That just, you know, that's just the kind of guy he was. You know, he could be a real softie too. My brother Mark told me this story about how, this is after I was gone from the house, but I was the oldest, so I went away to college, but Mark was talking about how sometimes he'd get in trouble and Dad would make him run around the house 10 times. We lived out in Quartz Hill and had 2.5 acres. Anyway, Mark would go running around the house, and after about 5 laps, Dad would come out and say, "Okay, Mark, 5's enough, 5's enough." But Mark would say, "But Dad, you said 10. "Oh, it's okay." One more story is about, I was away at college. It must have been about 1970. And a friend of mine who was still living in Lancaster called me one evening and she said, "You know, Sherry, I hadn't seen your parents for a while, but I dropped in on them today and I saw the most amazing thing." And I said, "What, Kathy?" And she said, "Well, I went over there and one of your brothers let me in the door, and I walked in the kitchen and there was your father making a big pot of soup, and he and your mother were just holding hands in the kitchen." She said, "How many parents do we know that have been married a gazillion years that would just be hanging out in the kitchen holding hands on a Sunday afternoon?" I said, "Wow, that's really something." Anyway, we certainly do miss him. He was such a unique individual. And I just want to say in closing, I think one of his very greatest achievements was surviving that X-15 crash and going on to fly it 22 more times and living 13 more years. I mean, they didn't know back in those days what they know today about head injuries, spinal cord injuries. And I just think it was his tough Scotch-Irish nature that really allowed him to keep on going. And I'll have to say, he wasn't the same man going into that accident as he was coming out of it, but it just took a long time for things to show up, and he never complained. I mean, I don't think I only heard him one time say something, and this was just a few months before he died. I'd come home for Christmas, and it was 1974. I'd been out of the country traveling around. Anyway, I came back and I said, "Gosh, Dad, you're not looking very well." And he said to me, "Oh, it's those darn pain pills they gave me. You know, they never did work very well." But it was almost said like a Jack McKay joke, not even a complaint. And of course, 4 months later, he was gone. And a short time after, Time magazine came out with an obituary calling him a steel nerve test pilot. And that was just wonderful, because he certainly was that. And now he's an astronaut, and we're so very proud. So anyway, I just want to thank everyone so much. My sister Susan had a request that I need to honor, that I thank. She works here on the base. And she wanted me to honor all the NASA employees that have worked so hard to keep the dream of space travel alive. And it's just amazing that my father and his friends have laid such a foundation that all of you here can move forward on and keep going into the future. And I thank my father. Just one more thing that I forgot to mention, that he would be especially proud. He never played favorites in our family, and that's hard to do when you have 8 kids. But to his credit, he didn't do that. He loved us all equally. But I think today he would be especially proud of his children that have followed him into the field of aviation. I want to mention my brother John, who retired recently as a branch chief in mechanics after 29 years. Mac works across the way over there at the Air Force lab. He's working on an environmentally safe rocket fuel. My sister Susan works for Lockheed here on the base. She has a very interesting job in security, and we all know how important security is this day and time. And my brother Jim never went into aviation professionally, but he's been a pilot most of his life. And now this is a guy that actually, he just sold one of his airplanes, but for a long time he had 2 private planes. And that's pretty remarkable to me. And he spends his spare time taking medical teams down to Baja, California to do their work there, help the people there. So anyway, thank you very much. We're so
Okay, next what we'd like to do is bring up Judy and Bill Dana. Judy will do the honors, and this ought to be entertaining. He's going to get even with you, Bill. And then afterwards, Bill's going to say a few words. Hey, Bill.
Well, thank you. The certificate I have here is from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It's presented to William H. Dana, NASA astronaut wings, in recognition of your 2 qualifying flights into space as an X-15 test pilot, achieving a maximum altitude of 306,900 feet. And after sitting through this, I know that was exactly the altitude you were going for that day. On achieving that right on the mark. And signed again by the 3 of us. So congratulations. It's truly an honor for me.
I'll give these to Judy. These are the astronaut wings. And she can maybe replace that with this. You want me to hold this for a second?
I won't talk long. You have to talk as an astronaut.
I just think it's fitting for Judy, who didn't get to give me my set of wings out of pilot training because I didn't even know her when I got my wings out of pilot training. I think it's fitting for her to place on me these wings that are so very special. And I want to thank Captain Rominger and Vance Brand for their gift to me. Thank you and good night.
You're beautiful, Bill. I love you. Now we're going to present another well-deserved tribute to our 3 honorees. Andrew Mercy of the State Senator George Runner's office has come with some special certificates for Bill Dana and the families of John McKay and Joe Walker in recognition of the receipt of astronaut wings. So I'd like to have Bill Dana, Sherry Lowe, and Jim Walker please come forward again.
Truly a humbling honor to be here to help honor the families and Bill Dana. I'll be very brief, but just to say thank you to everyone involved with the X-15 project. As someone who grew up here in the Antelope Valley, as did Senator Runner and Assemblywoman Sharon Runner, thank you because of you, we never had to look far from here for role models and heroes. And so on behalf of, along with Larry Grooms from Assemblywoman Sharon Runner's office, it's a pleasure to present these certificates. Okay, to the family of Joe Walker.
Okay, and finally, Johnny, come on up. He's going to return up here, and I'd like to, before you sit, Bill, come back up, Bill. And we'd also like to have Sherry and Grace, would you, and Jim, would you come forward? Johnny would like to present the families with the original flight logs.
Yeah, this collection, as I mentioned, that we quoted things from, had been carried from one building to the other building as I moved, and the places where they're stored kind of become famous today, known as the Armstrong Memorial Library. And it has such things as the flight request, which is the flight plan, the radio transcript, post-flight debriefing, technical debriefing, ops report, and the technical reports. So I thought it was very appropriate now to have these original documents, which was before Bill Gates' time, and it was done on typewriters and dictaphones for recording. So it's my pleasure to give this to you, Mr. Dana.
Oh, thank you, Johnny.
Okay.
And one other award or recognition we'd like to have is from Dr. Vic Levax, the Associate Administrator for Aeronautics from headquarters, who flew out here today. Vic?
Thank you, Steve. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a singular honor for me to be here today. In fact, if you can tell, I'm actually sort of overwhelmed by the whole thing, especially seeing Bill Dana get an award for doing anything right. So. Those of us who are proud to work for NASA know that NASA is a place of dreamers. Dryden, in particular, is a place of dreamers. It's a place where we turn dreams of today into technologies and products and ideas for tomorrow. We're all exceedingly proud of the ability to do that, which is based on the work that went before all of us. I like to think that we stand on the shoulders of giants. I wouldn't call you the dirty dozen, I'd call you the distinguished dozen, are the shoulders that we stand on today, and it is truly an honor for me to represent my agency in presenting to each of the families and to Bill a letter from our administrator, Dr. Mike Griffin, congratulating you also on your achievement. You know, about 40 years ago, you all were putting contrails in the skies here above the dry lake. I hope 40 years from now, we'll have an airplane flying on Mars. There is an atmosphere there. It's about like 100,000 feet here. And we'll be putting contrails over Mars in recognition of what you did for us. So if I may, I'll just wander. You don't have to come up here again. You'll never make it. Let me just for those of you who don't know me, I truly love NASA, and I truly love the people who work here. So, Bill, this is all meant in humble respect, but a little fun. So, I won't read the letters to you. They talk about the number of flights, all the information that you've had already. and talk about us standing on their shoulders as we bring the space shuttle back to flight. I really regret that my dear friend Bill Reeds isn't here today, who did bring our space shuttle program back online with the flight of Discovery. And so it talks about the fact that we are building what we do on what you all did. And we're all very, very grateful to the whole dynamic and distinguished.
Involved in the X-15 program. And those people that are here, would you please stand up so we can recognize everybody that was involved in the X-15 program out here at NASA Dryden? Please stand. Thank you all for that. In closing, I'd like to thank Neil Armstrong, Joe Engle, Bob White, for you gotta love it, Dana. You're just a wealth of great stuff about what life was like after the X-15 program ended in 1968. Often candid, always self-depreciating, Bill would put it this way to Milt. Scott Crossfield went on to become an airline president and consultant to Congress. Forrest Peterson went on to become vice admiral. Bob White and Bob Rushworth moved up to be major generals. Neil became an astronaut and was the first man to step out on the moon. Joe Engle became an astronaut and flew the space shuttle. Pete Knight became the mayor of Palmdale, and as we all know, a great deal more. That's quite an illustrious bunch of pilots. Then, as only Bill could say, and then there's you and me. I want you to stay around for a long, long time, Bill. Bill, Jack, and Joe, you're the best in our book. Many thanks to everyone for coming today. Please stay for some light refreshments and conversation. We have a lot of catching up to do. Thank you very much for attending.